So it occurs to me that by using the name Terminal 2W, I'm not using my name. I mean, my name's associated with the channel, but in point of fact, it's not the name of the channel. So it seemed appropriate this new venture be described as to who I am. I mean, what I mean is you don't know who I am, and you don't know me from Adam. So I thought as I ran some errands and went around town, I would do a quick video, probably not that quick, and tell the story of who I am and why I'm doing this. And right now, I'm at a Costco gas line getting gas. So any minute now, when I get to a pump, I'm going to be pausing for a minute. So who am I? Who am I, and what do I do? Well, my day job is in software engineering, and I've worked for a lot of different companies doing a lot of different things, but primarily I've been an engineering leader for the last 20 years. And I work for a multinational company now, and I am a remote worker. So I have some flexibility when it comes to travel that I've never had before in my life. And with that flexibility and the fact that my daughter is grown, I've decided that I want to do more travel, and believe you me, I've always done a lot. I thought I wanted to do more travel, and in the process of doing more travel, I thought I'd like to explore other videos. So I saw people like Noel Phillips and Josh Cahill doing their YouTube channels, and it resonated because they're doing something that I wanted to do when I wrote an airline industry blog for about 10 years. And I'll get to why I started doing that blog somewhere in the near future of this story. But with that in mind and watching their channels, this was something that I felt like I wanted to do. I'm one of those people that needs a project. And once I find a project that resonates, I can usually stick with that project. So who am I? What do I do? Where am I going with all this? Well, I'll tell you. I was born in Wisconsin. My parents moved us to Sherman, Texas, pretty shortly after I was born. I think I was about 18 months old. And we came to Sherman, Texas, because my father wanted to work for Johnson & Johnson and go to school. And there was a school in Sherman, Austin College, that was willing to give him a master's degree. So he started there, and the man who hired him quit and left days before he started to work. And his replacement boss didn't like him. So after a pretty short time, he started looking for jobs elsewhere, and he decided to go to work for Braniff International in their accounting department, as I recall. And primarily he wanted to do that because they could get him into the University of Dallas for a master's degree. And in getting that master's degree, he went to work for the airline, and because he's he's not a relatively smart person. He's a very smart man, and he has the quality of being an incredible worker. And he rose quickly at Braniff International Airlines. We, as a family, rose accordingly inside the airline, and we began to fly. We began to travel. I can remember traveling by airplane as far back as I can remember. And by that, I mean, I have memories going all the way back to when I was perhaps 3 or 4, maybe about the time that my brother was born. And I can remember being on airplanes and doing things. So we pretty quickly started to travel. And since my parents were married and came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a lot of our early travel was back to Milwaukee because there was family there, at least on my mother's side of the family, still is. And my parents began to travel internationally as my father rose up in the company. And we, as a family, began to go places on airplanes. I am about to get gas. Yep, I'm going to get out of my car right now, so I'm going to stop this recording for a minute. go fill up with gas, and continue this story. All right, so I'm back. I have a full tank and an afternoon to drive around the Dallas-Fort Worth area and capture some pictures of these places and things that I've done in the airline world. So my father rose as a very senior executive within the airline industry pretty quickly. He had the quality of being able to make sense of airline economics in ways that, for the period of time that he was in the airline business, was actually kind of unusual. And he had the quality of having the answer to the hard questions. And that got him the attention of the Braniff senior leadership, such as Eddie Acker, who started in the airline business with Braniff International, later went on to Air Florida and Pan American. And last I heard, Eddie Acker is still alive, which I think is good. And Harding Lawrence, the very famous chairman and CEO of Braniff International. Harding Lawrence played a big role in my father's career and development, and he frankly impacted our family a lot, which is probably worthy of a story in and of itself. But as my father rose, we gained more and more pass privileges, and it wasn't long before we were flying what at the time, and I don't know what airlines call it now, haven't bothered to look it up, but we had what were called Pase pass privileges with Braniff. That meant we could reserve space on the airplane and we could do it in first class. Now, admittedly, the family rule was is if somebody wanted a first class seat and we were in a first class seat, we gave it up. But it was a nice privilege to have, and it was a reserved space. And given that airplanes flew a load factor of about 55% at that time, there was always space. If there wasn't a seat in first class, which was pretty unusual, there was always a seat in coach. I don't recall ever being on a completely full Braniff International flight. For that matter, any flight by any airline in that era. They just weren't full. It was considered a full plane if you had about 60% capacity filled at that time. The joys of regulation. So we did a lot of flying as a family. I can remember flying in first class to Hawaii with my mother and spending a couple of weeks there. And I know that was in 1975. I can remember flying to London with my dad and my brother. I think that was in 1977 when my father was preparing to set up the Braniff Dallas-Fort Worth to London flights. And he did most of his travel for work. My mom took part mostly for pleasure. In fact, when my parents split up, my mom decided to go to India for 3 months as a part of an anthropology class that she was in. And it was through Braniff pass privileges that she was able to fly all the way to New Delhi. And she managed to earn, it was a whole flight to New Delhi, multiple stops, all in first class, and a good part of it on Air India. And that would have been pretty exotic at that time. That would have been 747s, that would have been connections through London. It would have been airlines that were at the peak of their service in many respects. At that time, Braniff didn't have over transatlantic anyway, flights that she could take. So that would have been on airlines like TWA or Pan Am, and then maybe in London, Air India, all the way to New Delhi. Anyway, when my parents split up, the unusual happened, and we started living with my dad. And we lived in an apartment in Irving, Texas, coming from a house in Irving, Texas. And I should mention a little bit about that house. That house was just 2 or 3 miles as the crow flies from DFW Airport. And when we first moved to that house, I can still remember the visceral sound of jets taking off from that airport. Not just DFW, but Greater Southwest Airport, which was just south of where DFW is now. And because of the first generation of turbojets and turbofans, the noise was incredible. Like, I can remember being in our house, planes would take off, and there would be enough of a roar to kind of rattle the house a little bit. And you wouldn't get close to that today. Planes can fly over houses these days and not be heard. When I was a kid and we lived in that house, it was a house on a street called Chime Street that we lived in for, I think, 3 or 4 years. I badly wanted to be a pilot. I think every kid at that age, in some respects, dreamed of being a pilot if they had that dream. And I had that dream until I was close to middle school. And then somebody dashed my hopes by explaining to me that I couldn't become a pilot in the military because I didn't have perfect eyesight. I'm pretty farsighted. And I've only gotten more farsighted. So, yeah, that made me give up a dream that, in hindsight, and what I've learned today, there were many other paths to becoming an airline pilot in those days, but everybody told me that you became an airline pilot by going to learn how to fly planes in the military, and you did that for 6 years, and then you got out and you became a pilot, and that was the way it was done, period. So, a lot of flying, a lot of flying as the children of an airline executive. About a year or so, maybe 2 after my parents split up with a divorce in 1976, my mother went to Portland, Oregon, and she originally said she was going for 6 weeks because she wanted to see what it was like there. She had a boyfriend who was moving there. And after about 6 weeks, we realized that she was probably not coming back soon. And because, again, we were the children of an airline executive, we began to commute up there for our visitation with our mother. So from about that point until about, I want to say it was sometime around late or maybe early 1981 when my father left Braniff, we flew to Portland, Oregon about twice a month to spend weekends with our mother. There was a time in my early 20s when my dad and I were talking, and we both conservatively calculated that I had probably flown somewhere between 2 and 3 million miles already by that age, as a function of all the travel that we did as a family and all the travel that I did to go and see my mother. And, he's probably not wrong. He himself was doing a tremendous amount of flying, but oddly enough, not with the airline. It was only later in his career where he really became a big flyer, and he lives as a permanent high status member of both American Airlines and nothing like an alarm on your phone coming through. American Airlines, let's see, he's had status with American Airlines that's been permanent. I think he has permanent platinum status with American and similar permanent status with United Airlines. And he's had that since the mid-90s. But he did most of his travel when he began to be a venture capitalist and after he left a telephone business. So the 80s came. My father left Braniff. I'm back. I noticed my camera was not aimed correctly, so I decided to pull over and aim the camera. So, gonna get back on the highway here in a minute. Let's talk about where I left off. So it was the 80s, didn't do much travel. Early 90s, got married, didn't do much travel. And then around 1993, after I'd been married a couple years, I badly wanted to go to Mexico City. I wanted to start traveling again, and I had a stable job and a way to do it, so I did it. And that started my life of travel again. Now, I did notice that my American Airlines Advantage number dates from like 1988 or 1989, so I've had it for nearly 40 years. And I can't remember why I got it. I mean, clearly I was traveling, and likely it was a rare trip to some place like Portland, Oregon to see my family. But I have no strong recollection as to why. Interesting fact. I collected miles on that account without a single redemption until I was able to actually finally redeem the miles in 2001 to go to Australia. Who'd have thought? So I started traveling a little more, and I became interested in airlines because I'm an airline brat. And I started getting airline magazines, and I started buying books about airlines. There was a great author who did a number of histories on early airlines, who was the brother of Rod Serling of the famous show Twilight. And Rod Serling was the brother of, I think his name was Robert Serling. And Robert Serling made a career as an author, writing both a few fiction books, but mainly histories of airlines. And they're excellent. And if you get a chance, if you're an airline fan and you want to hear about the golden days of airlines, these books are the books to have. They are better than most. And I'd say, let's see, I think his last book was on Alaska Airlines. And I thought his book on Alaska Airlines was as good as any work he had ever done. He's a patient and deliberate and creative author. So I studied airlines. I became a fan. I started traveling more. But traveling more for me was still pretty infrequent. And by infrequent, I traveled a few times a year by airplane, usually to places like Wisconsin or Oregon to visit family, occasionally Virginia to see my father, and the odd trip to just go see stuff like New Orleans or Seattle. I can remember going to Seattle a few times. It was a pretty normal life, as what most people live when they travel by airplanes. I did normal things. I got a divorce. I lived alone. I traveled more after my divorce. I was more interested in longer distance traveling. I took my first really big trips in the early 2000s. I say I took my first, but my honeymoon with my first wife was really my first truly big international trip. We flew to Germany. Well, we flew to Switzerland and drove around Switzerland and Germany for, I think, 8 days. And then we flew back from Munich. So I think we went into Zurich and we flew back from Munich. And I would say that made a very big impression on me. Strangely, I don't remember as much of the flight over as I would think that I would, but I don't. But in the early 2000s, I went to places like Australia and Russia. In fact, in the same year of 2001, I went to Australia in March of 2001, spent 10 days there, and then I went to Moscow and St. Petersburg via Helsinki in June of 2001. I was there for not quite 3 weeks. And I would say that's really when the bug started. So I'm traveling, I'm enjoying my life. I think things are good. I left a company where I had gotten involved in a lot of software work, and I was doing a lot of e-commerce work and trying to get a job. And so I was doing some side work, doing web development, and I wanted to show people that a blog could dramatically change the views of their e-commerce website. And the only way I could do that, in my mind, was to do an experiment and show people starting a website from scratch and how I drove traffic to it with content by writing a blog. And since I was going to do this experiment, I needed to do it on something that I had an opinion, something that I knew a lot about, and something that I had a passion for, and something that I had an opinion for. And I did have an opinion. I had an opinion on airlines. And that was a great time to have an opinion on airlines. I got involved and I started writing because I thought airlines were at a low point in the creation of, or in the service industry. I thought they were at a low point because every airline at that point, excuse me, every airline at that point was struggling to make a dollar. Airlines were notoriously losing money hand over foot. They were trying to win market share at any cost. There were airline mergers that, hindsight being 2020, probably weren't the smartest mergers because they were really oriented around just removing competition. And the problem with that is once you remove that competition, more competition shows up because it didn't change the market. And that's definitely what was going on. And more importantly than anything else, I had this belief that airlines were failing because they had a terrible service product. I thought they could be a lot better. By a terrible service product, I mean flight attendants that were openly hostile to passengers, schedules that were based so much around high frequency and win the passenger at any cost that planes left late. Coordinating connections in cities was difficult. Pricing was very haphazard, not rational, not reflective of what the market could support. And at the same time, there were some new entrants. Virgin America was coming to be, and JetBlue had shown up on the market and was killing it at that time. And you had Spirit and Allegiant and Frontier starting to make some visible brand moves in the market as well. So things were changing. It was a good time. And I started writing the blog, and it turned out I had a tremendous amount to say because over the course of 9 or 10 years, I wrote the Flying Colors blog, and I did an average number of words per blog entry and totaled up the blog entries, and it came out to something just over 1 million words written. Sometimes when I read those blog entries today, I realized that there was just a lot of anger in me, a lot of frustration. I frankly, I was throwing a lot of rocks emotionally, and I think I could have done so much better if I'd had opinions that were more founded in a certain more reasonable air. But I learned a lot. I studied airline industry and read other people's writings and looked at interviews and followed the airlines on airline magazines. And I could tell you just about everything that was going on in the airline world at any one given moment around the world. And occasionally I got to speak at a few events For instance, there's a gentleman named Ben Cass who runs a Braniff International Foundation or Braniff Airways Foundation. I spoke at his event around Braniff history and architecture a couple of times and did some other things that were fun to do. It was fun to have an opinion. It was fun to have a lot of the icons of the airline business, a lot of the men who were from the first and second generation of the airlines would come up to me, and yes, it was almost always men. They would come up to me and say, "You really nailed it. You understand. Not everyone gets it." One of the best compliments I ever got was from Sam Coates, who's probably worked for more airlines than many people have had different kinds of food. And Sam Coates came up to me after a Braniff conference and complimented me about my presentation about why Braniff failed for reasons that went far beyond even its CEO. That it had a lot to do with the economy and the marketplace and how dramatically things were changing in the world, for which the airline had really very little control over, really no control over. And Sam said that I was the first person that presented on the world as it actually was, instead of the way so many people wanted it to have been like. And I thought, coming from Sam, that was one of the finest compliments you could get in this business. So I did that for a long time. Like I said, about 10 years. It was actually the American Airlines US Airways merger that broke me. The mergers post 2008 were fast and furious. And there was a lot of controversy and a lot of excitement going on, and it was possible to write something about those mergers almost every day. And I thought the most brilliant merger made in airline history was the one between Northwest Airlines and Delta. I thought that was masterful. And I thought it was masterful because of the complementary nature of the merger. It was really the first time that two airlines came together in a very complementary way, as opposed to a buying market share or eliminating competition way. And I was fascinated that someone finally saw the genius of doing it that way and did something different. And then came Continental and United, which was a really frustrating merger. And I give them credit for being where they are today, but I still think that's a merger that in many respects failed to realize some of the genuine opportunities. And actually, if the truth be told, I don't think they were the right marriage. I think the two CEOs wanted to be married together so they didn't have to go and marry another airline that they just emotionally didn't like. So I never thought the United merger was that great. It worked. It's a successful airline today. I would actually point out it's in part successful because of its CEO, who came from American Airlines. But at the end of the day, it happened. I thought the American Airlines and US Airways merger was crazy, but crazy like a fox in a way. I thought it was crazy because I really wasn't sure that the leaders of American Airlines would truly give in and let Doug Parker take over that business. Doug Parker was not, how do I put this? I feel like everyone looked at Doug Parker as the white trash of the airline business. And in fact, I think he was one of the smartest airline executives of his generation. But Doug Parker managed to pull it off. And he did things with that airline that really turned it around. The airline needed its bankruptcy. It got bought. It got run by people who understood, I think, the fundamentals of what was being sold in the marketplace. And I would say that they understood that they needed to come to the market by getting they needed to get the traveler who needed the connections and the frequency. They needed the idea. So they needed to get an airline into a place where it could sell a very reliable basic product. The flights needed to leave on time. They didn't need to be the fastest to their destination, but if you said they were leaving at 9:30 a.m., they needed to leave at 9:30 a.m. And if the flights were going to provide a connection in Charlotte, they needed to arrive in Charlotte on time to make that connection. And they were very good at scraping away market share by offering connections that were very inexpensive against competitors who were flying nonstops. So they got people to retry American Airlines after a lot of frustration by offering a very rock bottom fare, but you had to connect. So it was incremental money on a flight that was going to go anyway. It was market share that got people exposed to the airline again. And it worked with me. I started flying on U.S. Airways and then later American Airlines, between Dallas and Virginia, because flying a connection through Charlotte was about 40% cheaper than a nonstop flight. And that was real money to be saved. And to be honest, U.S. Airways had a very comfortable product. It had a comfortable seat. It had airplanes that were reasonably comfortable. I thought that, frankly, they were a better airline than American Airlines. And when the merger came, I was very happy to see the philosophies of Doug Parker take over at American Airlines. And I think that he was a great success with the airline. I think they're having struggles today that in some respects don't make sense to me, but that's probably another one of these videos at a later time. So I've spent about 12 years away from the blog, and I've reached a new stage in my life. And that stage is I am now in my late 50s. I can afford to travel more frequently. I have the flexibility to travel more frequently. I live in a city where making connections to places around the country and around the world is very easy. And I found those other airline YouTube channels and wanted to try this. And so I needed to think of a name. And the name, which is Terminal 2W, came about because of my history in the airlines. When I was a little boy in that house on Chime Street in Irving, and I could hear those airplanes, they were coming from DFW. And when, as a small child, we stopped going to Love Field Airport, we started flying out of DFW. And Braniff International was the only airline to open at that airport that had a full terminal to itself. Continental, American, and Eastern, I think it was, shared a terminal by themselves, a terminal that was called 2 East, and it's now what is labeled as Terminal A at DFW. And then there were a few other airlines at Terminal C. Don't think Terminal E was built yet. I think it came later for Delta. And then there was Terminal 2 West, and Terminal 2 West was Braniff. And Terminal 2 West, which had, I think, like 25 or 27 gates to begin with, was a real airline hub almost from the beginning. And it's now what is Terminal B at DFW Airport. And it became Terminal B after a renumbering of the terminals that, frankly, I think does make sense. The truth is when you said Terminal 2W or Terminal 2E, people were always directionally challenged because a great many of them would come in from the north exit, and people would get confused as to which was west and which was east. And the way you exited to those terminals was the opposite direction of where the terminal was. So I began my life flying airplanes with great frequency out of Terminal 2W. And Terminal 2W was my home terminal, if you will. It was the terminal I flew the most out of. I do have some vague recollections of flying out of Love Field, but honestly, my recollections of Love Field, I think, are mixed up with a few other older airports, such as Milwaukee's Billy Mitchell and the original Denver Stapleton and Chicago O'Hare. For sure, Chicago O'Hare. Flew there a lot as a kid. But Terminal 2 West in Braniff was where I really developed my relationship with flying. And since I wanted that YouTube channel to be kind of a travel terminal, an airline hub, if you will, I was looking for names and I chose 2W. And 2W exists today. So in a few minutes, I'm going to get out of my car because I'm going into DFW to stop for a minute. And we're going to take a picture and talk a minute about Terminal 2W and what I remember about it. And then I think, time permitting, I'm going to go over to the viewing center and try and do a shot or two from there. And I may even take a visit over to the houses that I've lived in. So I'm going to get through the airport right now and we'll see what's next. Here we are at Terminal 2W. Today it's known as Terminal 2B, or really Terminal B, I should say. And the fact of the matter is it's largely unchanged today than from when it was when I was a small child coming here. In fact, I'm probably standing in a place where our family likely parked to go on trips as a member of the Braniff family. But let's take a quick look. Today, this terminal is used by American Airlines for its express flights. American Airlines, American Eagle flights largely take off from here, although some traffic has recently shifted over here as they work on Terminal C. But at the meantime, the additions really are a different train system. Skylink's here instead of AirTran, and AirTran ran down below, and Skylink runs up above, and it's airside to boot. And in addition to that, we've got a few small items that American has put into place to make it more comfortable for the people using this terminal. But this terminal hasn't been renovated. It hasn't been rebuilt. It really hasn't been added to. And that makes it pretty unusual. Let's go take a look at the viewing center. Well, as luck would have it, I arrived just as an Airbus A380 landed from British Airways. That would have been a great capture for this video. But let's take a look around and see what we've got here.
Contact ground 45. Whiskey 2, occurred across 18 left.
And there is the UPS hub, a regional hub. And it's kind of surprising to me, but usually there's about 5 more aircraft there than there are today. Let's take a look over here. You'll never be able to see it, but the big Airbus A380 that just came in is taxiing into Terminal D. And over here, in the distance, right in front of where that aircraft is taxiing to the runway, that is Terminal 2 West, or Terminal B today.
Airline left with chaos. Left there, pick up our Delta 730, DFW Tower, Airline left, launch ready,
Okay, that's enough. We've seen plenty here. And I think now's the time to end our video. So I want to thank you for joining me. I ask you to like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.